Welcome to Lecture 18, the end of the Cold War. So, if you guys remember back Lecture 11, we talked about the beginning of the Cold War, and then we periodically talked about the Cold War through the course, this last half of the course. What I'd like to do now is discuss the end of the Cold War, and so we're going to end it, 1992. The first few slides, though, what I want to do is kind of review what we've gone over up to now. Okay, first I want to review some information to get us to kind of where we need to be. Remember from Lecture 11 the definition of the Cold War, diplomatic and military struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1992. Remember, we covered the various characteristics of the Cold War, espionage, spying, some of the best and most interesting stories of the Cold War, espionage. Remember, we talked about, espionage stories started a whole genre of movies and TV shows about spying. Perhaps the most famous being James Bond in the 60s, and then they do movies even today. We talked a lot about, between the Soviets and the U.S., increased competition in various aspects of the world. I mean, all the way from not just military and nuclear weapons, but all the way down to who has the best kitchen, who wins the most Olympic medals, who gets to space first. And so you have this competition between these two superpowers at the top of the mountain, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We spent a lot of time when we talked about Lecture 11, we spent a lot of time talking about that race for allies and clients in the third world, the developing world of Africa and Asia and South America. And we talked about that chessboard where, the U.S. and the Soviet Union compete for friends and allies, with foreign aid and military intervention, money and weapons. So you're racing around the world to kind of contain or check the other team. We spent some time talking about the nuclear arms race. It gets to the point where you have mutually assured destruction, right? By the 1970s, our nuclear arsenals are so big, our bombs are so big that you can destroy each other 8 times over. We talked about proxy wars. We talked about the Korean War. We talked about the Vietnam War. Later on, we'll talk about Afghanistan, Nicaragua. The Cold War is filled with these proxy conflicts in the third world, or the developing world, where the Soviets and the U.S. race to help your team, right? We can't fight directly, otherwise we'll have a nuclear conflict. So, what do? You get your friends to fight for you. And then whichever side wins proves the superiority of your economic system. Okay. Remember, so from Truman to, not really Nixon, but Truman to Johnson, remember American foreign policy with the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations is one of containment, right? Every move the Soviets make, the U.S. is going to contain them. We're going to keep the Soviets where they are. We don't want the Soviets to expand beyond, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, right? And so containment's a big policy. With the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administration, remember we just got done talking about the 70s, it's détente, easing of tensions, right? We want to try to negotiate and have diplomatic solutions for our conflicts, and rather than getting our proxies to fight for us in the third world, let's work out diplomatic solutions. So for the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administration in the 1970s, you have détente. With Ronald Reagan, we talked about in the 1980s lecture, Ronald Reagan wanted to go beyond containment, critiquing détente as soft on communism and allowing the Soviets to win. The Reagan administration took containment one step farther to confronting the Soviet Union, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire Not only are we going to move against to contain the communism, but even to roll it back in places like, well, we talked about with Ronald Reagan, Afghanistan and Nicaragua. Okay, then remember in lecture 11, and then kind of a little bit periodically through the other lectures. Lecture 11, the end of the Cold War. Lecture 12, the 1950s. 13 was American conservatism. 14 was the 1960s. And then lecture 15 being the Vietnam War. We talked about some major events in Europe, like the division of Germany and Berlin, right? We talked about the Berlin airlift, where Stalin was wanting to cut off Western access to Berlin. So what do? You blockade it. And so what did the Allies do? The U.S. and Western Europe, you daily hundreds of flights into West Berlin to feed it, to supply it, and break the blockade. We talked about Soviet political and military domination of Eastern European nations. We talked about U.S. support replacing British support in Turkey and Greece, right? And that was the Truman Doctrine, right? Truman says, you know what, the British can no longer be an anti-communist bulwark. The British can no longer maintain their empire. So what will we do? Wherever the communists move, we will move. So this is an example of the containment doctrine being sent, or a containment policy being sent. And remember with Turkey and Greece, $400 million to support Turkey and Greece in their anti-communist fighting their anti-communist guerrillas. Remember the Marshall Plan. The U.S. government sends ultimately billions of taxpayer dollars to rebuild Western Europe. Nuclear weapons development. We talked about nuclear arms race. We talked about setting up the teams, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Remember World War I was one of the causes of World War I, right? Two hostile alliances facing each other across Europe. Well, here we go. After World War II, you have the same thing, right? NATO, Western Europe, and the U.S. versus the communist Warsaw Pact. Stalin died in 1955. We kind of went over that. Khrushchev taking over. I don't believe I mentioned the Hungarian Revolt in 1955, but your textbook does. Middle East and Africa. We talked about the creation of the State of Israel, the Suez Canal crisis, and then wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Okay. Here in the Western Hemisphere, remember we talked about Castro coming to power in Cuba. So that leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. CIA interference in elections like Guatemala in 1954. Historians argue the CIA interfered in Iran's elections as well in the 50s. There's evidence that was a little overblown. Governments in Central and South America, creation of the UN. In Asia, right, we rebuilt Japan as a westernized anti-communist society. We talked about the fall of China, Republic of China. So you have big communist China, and then you have the Republic of China or Taiwan. Then we have the Korean War. We talked about that. Then, of course, we talked about the Vietnam War and the insurgencies, communist insurgencies in Laos and Cambodia. And so, remember when we talked about the 60s, we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the accomplishments of the Kennedy administration was beginning U.S. and Soviet negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons. We spent a whole lecture on the Vietnam War. The Cultural Revolution in China is occurring during this era. You can look that up. I would argue the United States today is going through a similar cultural revolution with some of the same stuff that happened in China. You can look that up and decide that for yourself. The Prague Spring, we didn't talk about this, I don't think, in class. But Czechoslovakia attempts to overthrow its communist government. Other Warsaw Pact nations invade and keep Czechoslovakia within the Warsaw Pact. The space race we talked about, right? Sputnik, U.S. space program, getting us to the moon, right? We just got to talk about the 70s, right? We talked about detente with the Nixon administration, the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks, talked about MAD, mutually assured destruction. Nicaragua, remember the background in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, remember in the early 70s, 60s, 70s, you had the Somoza government running Nicaragua. In the late 1970s, the Somoza government, an anti-communist dictatorship, is overthrown by the Sandinistas. They're generally considered a leftist group. Depending on where you are in the political spectrum, they're either communists or, Marxist communists, or just, very liberal, want to, expand healthcare, stuff like that. But they're communists. And, Cuba and the Soviet Union both support these Sandinistas in overthrowing the Somoza dictatorship. The Sandinista government, once they take over in the late 70s, they will be opposed militarily by a group called the Contras. The Contras are a broad coalition of anti-communist and anti-Sandinista groups. Some of them are, legit, innocent, just political opposition groups to the Sandinistas. There are some Contra groups that are a little on the shady side, mainly in drug dealing. And so, that when you get to the 80s, you have a critique of the Contras being a bunch of drug dealers. That's not true. It is not dominated by drug dealers. There are drug dealers as a part of it, because the broad coalition of opposition to the the Sandinista regime. In Afghanistan, in the mid-70s, you had a pro-Western anti-communist government overthrown by a communist coup. Well, the communist regime is nearly overthrown by local warlords in 1979, which causes Russia, the Soviet Union, to invade in December 1979 to support its communist regime. Historians call this the Soviet Union's Vietnam because, it's very similar to the plot of the Vietnam War, right? We had an anti-communist South Vietnamese government that was invaded by communist North Vietnam. So what do? We send in 500,000 troops to protect our baby, the anti-communist South Vietnamese government. Okay. And so those are some of the stuff we talked about in the 70s. Okay. So, overall, we're going to talk about 4 extremely important individuals in ending the Cold War. The top 4. Right here, we're going to talk about the top 3 individuals. Number 1, Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II hails from Poland, born and raised in Poland. He's worked his way up through the Catholic Church, becomes a cardinal, and in 1978 he is made or elected Pope of the Catholic Church. After the Cold War, when Soviet archives were opened, we learned that the election of Pope John Paul II as Pope greatly worried, extremely worried, Soviet leaders. Because Pope John Paul II was extremely anti-communist, vocally anti-communist. Even when he was, wasn't Pope, when in Poland as a cardinal and a bishop, he openly, vocally anti-communist. And what later on we find out that Soviets and the Polish governments are extremely worried, when you have, a Pope that's from a communist country and is vocally anti-communist. One of the things Pope John Paul II wanted to do was to visit his homeland in Poland. And again, after the Cold War, when Soviet archives, the Polish archives are opened to the Western historians, we learned that there was a big debate about whether to let Pope John Paul II return to his homeland and preach to his own people. The concern was that it would cause a resurgence of Catholicism in the officially atheistic Polish government. What ends up kind of tipping the scale to letting the Pope visit Poland is the argument that it's been decades. Surely Catholicism has been stamped out. Surely the people after 4 decades of atheistic communism are no longer religious. So they eventually, and they're also worried about what the West, kind of political pressure from the West. They're worried about that, causing a problem. So the Polish and Soviet governments do end up letting Pope John Paul visit Poland. Guess what? Millions come out to see the Pope. So what did this tell the Soviet and Polish leadership? That they were not as their atheistic communism was not as popular as they thought, right? People may have been outwardly communist and atheistic, but obviously on the inside they were still Catholic, and they had very strong feelings for their Catholic Pope, their Polish Catholic Pope. And so Pope John Paul II is considered one of the foundations of ending the Cold War, in that he really opens up this idea that people living in these communist countries, they're not as indoctrinated as you think. They're not as brainwashed as you think. Okay, and it also showed kind of the lack of support for the communist government as well. Next, Ronald Reagan. So American historians generally don't like Ronald Reagan, mainly because of politics. Ronald Reagan's a conservative Republican. A lot of U.S. historians are progressive Democrats or progressive, and so some of their political biases kind of filter into kind of discounting Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's greatness and importance to American history and world history. Ronald Reagan is an extremely important figure in the ending the Cold War. And when you study the primary documents, you see that. Whether you disagree with them or not politically, it would be invalid or inappropriate to say Reagan didn't have anything to do with the end of the Cold War. He had an extreme amount to do with the ending of the Cold War. You want some proof? Go to Eastern Europe. There are statues to Ronald Reagan. Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and Soviet leadership after the Cold War, they all identified Ronald Reagan as an important figure in ending the Cold War. Okay, and so Ronald Reagan's policy of rejecting détente and confronting the Soviet Union. One of the ways that Ronald Reagan confronted the Soviet Union is our defense budget quadrupled. And it caused the Soviet Union to try to catch up, and they couldn't. The Soviet Union, they couldn't catch up, and it ended up kind of tipping the Soviet economy over. Okay, and so Ronald Reagan also was a very vocal world stage opponent, a very vocal opponent of communism on the world stage. Every UN speech, every time he went to Europe, very vocal that the Soviet Union needs to open up. His probably most famous speech, 1987, telling Mikhail Gorbachev, tear down this wall, right, in Berlin. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, member of the Conservative Party, she's also considered a major factor in maintaining, getting support within the NATO alliance to confront the communists. Not just get along with them, not just let them expand, but actually to stop them. This may surprise a lot of students. This usually surprises students. Guess what? No one saw the end of no one saw the end of communism in Eastern Europe in the fall of the Soviet Union coming. No one. CIA. No one saw it coming. And so it's kind of interesting how the fall of communism in Eastern Europe kind of comes about. It kind of comes out rapidly. No one really sees it coming. And so it's like, it is actually a big surprise when it happens in 1989. Then, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the 1980s, the image of the Eastern Bloc was that it was a strong Warsaw Pact alliance. Economies were good. There was a lot of propaganda out there that kind of masked the reality of what was going on in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The reality in the 70s and 80s was that Eastern Europe and Russia were in some cases decades behind the Western European economies. And so their economies were stagnant, low to no growth. They weren't technologically advancing. And so it kind of masked, the reality was masked by this idea that, oh, look at our armies, look at our military. The Soviet Union did have a space program, but the technology was stuck in the 60s while, the U.S. is building space shuttles and, developing their programs. In the early 80s, the Soviet Union couldn't keep its leaders alive. 3 Soviet premiers of the era died within 2 years. Ronald Reagan one time was asked if he was willing to meet with the Soviets, and he says, I would love to, but, they keep dying on me. So. The fifth major, most important individual in the Cold War is, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev. He came to power in 1985 as the Soviet premier. He's young, 50s. He was by far the youngest on the Politburo. The Politburo is the head council of the Soviet Union. He rose through the ranks in agricultural departments and government, regulatory bodies. And Gorbachev recognizes that the Soviet Union is behind. The Soviet economy is stagnated. A lot of policies and procedures and plans go all the way back to the Stalin era. We're in the 80s now. Stalin's been dead since 1955. We're now in 1985, right? 3 decades later. And so Gorbachev recognized the need to reform Soviet society, reform the Soviet economy. And this is very important because there's a myth out there sometimes that Mikhail Gorbachev brought about the end of the Soviet Union and he wanted to. He did not. Mikhail Gorbachev just recently died. He was actually alive up until this last year. Mikhail Gorbachev was always a committed Marxist. His goal was always to reform communism. Okay, he didn't want to see it go away. So he wanted to reform Marxism and kind of get the Soviet Union ahead. Some of the things he does, he reduces military spending and ends foreign engagements. For example, the Soviet Vietnam ended in 1989 when Soviet troops left Afghanistan. He renounces the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said that the Soviet Union would keep, by force, all Eastern European countries in the Warsaw Pact. The Gorbachev administration also begins expanding nuclear arms talks, and then Gorbachev discusses perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika is Russian for restructuring. Glasnost is Russian for publicity or openness. And so that's what Gorbachev wants. He thinks if people kind of open up, we can restructure Soviet society and the economy. What's unfortunate is, what does Gorbachev find out? People don't want to restructure People don't want to restructure communism. They want communism to go away. On the final exam, I'm going to ask you a question. Give me examples or discuss examples of communism ending peacefully. Okay. There's 3 examples for Eastern Europe. Poland, we'll talk about first. The man you want to know is Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa started he was a shipyard worker in Poland, northern coast of Poland, and he begins what's called the Solidarity Movement. It's a workers' labor union that he started. He started organizing protests in this movement to protest low wages, poor working conditions, no benefits to Polish workers. In 1982, the Solidarity Movement was crushed by force by the Polish government. Walesa was put in prison. People disappeared. People would disappear. Protesters were shot. So the Solidarity Movement does go underground for several years. Then we kind of talk about the Pope coming to Poland. By 1989, the Solidarity Movement kind of breaks out again. Lech Walesa is released from prison. Protests start again. And this time, the Polish government has another choice to make. Do we keep shooting like we did last time? Or do we just kind of negotiate with this Solidarity Movement? After the Cold War ended and we study Soviet archives, we find out that the Polish government actually asked Mikhail Gorbachev to send in the troops. The Polish government was not wanting, in 1989, the Polish government was not wanting to shoot its own people. They did not want to violently put down this revolt. Well, remember the Brezhnev Doctrine. We're not going to forcibly keep anyone in the in the Warsaw Pact. So Gorbachev, after the Cold War, the records indicate Gorbachev tells the Polish government, we're not intervening. We're not sending in the tanks. You don't want to shoot your own people. We're not going to shoot them either. And so the Polish government decides to not put down the Solidarity Movement by force. So they end up having to negotiate. Elections are held in May of 1989. The Solidarity Movement, now a political party, wins every seat that they are allowed to contest. The communist governments set aside some seats for them. Like these seats can only be communist. And so Lech Walesa is elected president of Poland, and so that's how Poland becomes non-communist. Czechoslovakia, as the protests are going on and the elections are going on in Poland, protests break out in Czechoslovakia, led by a group led by Václav Havel, a Czech actor. These protests get so bad they shut down the economy. They're weeks-long protests. Basically, Czechoslovakia just stops working. Just everyone's out protesting. The government, just like in Poland, has a choice. They choose not to shoot their people, and they kind of capitulate to the protests, and they will hold elections as well. Václav Havel will be elected president. In East Germany, so East Germany borders a communist country called Hungary. In late 1988, the Hungarian government announced that it was no longer going to keep its border closed, meaning if people wanted to go to Austria, a non-communist country, they could. So guess what a lot of East Germans did? A lot of East Germans went on vacation to Hungary, and then they disappear into Austria. The Hungarian government ignored repeated protests by the East German government to shut its border, and we're leaving, right? No one wants to live in the workers' paradise. Along with this border issue with Hungary, protests break out in major East German cities, just like in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The East German government, after the Cold War ends and we open Soviet and East German archives, we learn that just like the Polish government asked the Soviets to start shooting, the East German government also asked the Soviet government, we don't want to shoot our own people. Can you do it? Mikhail Gorbachev, just like in Poland, refuses to shoot the protesters. So East Germany, the East German government has to either do something, capitulate, do reform, do something. Well, rather than capitulate and have the government fall, the East German government in October and November 1989, they decide we'll try to reform our immigration policy that will allow East Germans to leave East Berlin and go to West Berlin. Okay, hoping that this would calm the protests down. The Berlin Wall comes down when the government announces that they're changing their policy. The spokesman for the East German government miscommunicates the new policy and makes a lot of East Berliners think that the border's open. Well, so November 1989, one night, all these protesters go to these checkpoints, and they start to try to cross. So it's a tense moment because these East German soldiers are like, are they going to fire? Or are they going to let the protesters go through? When protesters realize that these East German soldiers are not going to shoot the protesters, protest begins, well, not even protests, celebrations begin on both sides of the wall, and people literally just start dismantling the wall right then and there with axes and hammers and, sledgehammers. The wall, literally, protesters just start demolishing the wall right there. You can go look at YouTube. There's some dramatic footage of that. Germany will be reunited in 1990. So that's why today, like when I was your age, when I was in high school, it was West and East Germany. Now it's just Germany. On the final, you will be asked what are some violent ends to communism. There's two examples, Romania and Yugoslavia. Romania is led by a man named Nicolae Ceausescu, who was a protege of Stalin. Okay, Stalin's been dead for 3 decades, but Nicolae Ceausescu is still around. The protests that are paralyzing Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia and East Germany, they come to Romania too. How is the Romanian government different? Ceausescu orders the military to start shooting protesters. Kind of a mini civil war breaks out when some military units do start shooting the protesters, and other units don't. For several weeks, there will be a kind of a mini civil war as some military units support the Ceausescu government, and some military units support the protesters. Some military units just flat out join the protesters. Okay, so you have a several-week civil war. That civil war ends when Ceausescu and his wife are captured. They had been hiding out at a pro-Ceausescu military base for several weeks. The base commander switched sides. And, kind of ratted out Ceausescu. On Christmas Eve, 1989, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife will be put on trial. And then the next day, on Christmas Day, they'll be dragged out into the snow and shot. Yugoslavia is another place where the Cold War ends violently. What happens when the lid comes off? And that is the next several slides, which we'll go over here momentarily. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is Serbo-Croatian for South Slav. Okay, Eastern Europe has hundreds of ethnic groups. Okay, and a lot of them are Slavic, ethnically Slavic groups. So Slavic is a general term, and then underneath that you have all these different ethnic groups. Yugoslavia means South Slavs. So the Balkans is a region of southeastern Europe, and like I said, home to dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups, nationalities, and even religions. You have Catholicism, you have Eastern Orthodox, you have Islam, and then you have a Jewish population as well. So, I mean, the Balkans is a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different religions and cultures. Okay. After World War I, the World War I victors take dozens of these ethnic groups and they put them into a multi-ethnic state called Yugoslavia. Okay? And again, it means South Slavs. There are three major ethnic groups that we need to talk about that you need to make sure you know. Okay? The Serbs, the Serbian people, is an ethnic group. It's a nationality or an ethnic group. They're Slavic. Most Serbs are Orthodox Christian. Okay? The Croats, they're Slavic people. They are Catholic. They're largely Catholic. The Bosnians, the Bosnians people, a Bosnian nation or culture or nationality, it's a mix of Slavic people and Turkish people. A lot of Bosnians, when the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Ottoman Empire ruled Eastern Europe, a lot of Bosnians converted to Islam. So you have a lot of Bosnians that are Islamic. Okay, so Serbs are Orthodox, Croats are Catholic. A lot of Bosnians are Muslim. So they're European, right? They're light skinned like me. They're European, but they're Muslim. They're Islamic because when the Muslim Ottoman Empire ruled Eastern Europe, they converted. There's all kinds of other ethnic groups: Macedonians, Kosovars, Greeks, Bulgars, Hungarians, Romanians, Albanians, Roma, which are gypsies, and the list goes on and on and on. There's tons of them. Okay. So after World War I, a bunch of these ethnic groups were kind of put into one country, and they said, okay, you guys are Yugoslavia. Okay. During World War II, the Germans and Italians both tried to invade, they did invade, with eventually the Germans taking over Yugoslavia. And this kind of breaks up the different ethnic groups. The Croats generally supported German expansion. And in fact, the German government even helps create an independent fascist Croatian state in the region, for their support for German expansion into Yugoslavia. The Serbs generally opposed German expansion, and Croats as well. And so a lot of Serbs allied with the Soviet Union to fight against Germany and the Croatian state. Okay. In World War I, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, they liberated Yugoslavia from German occupation by late 1944. So, 1945, a man named Tito is going to take over. Tito is Serb. Tito is going to take over. He's going to become the dictator, the communist dictator of Yugoslavia and all these groups. Okay. The Yugoslav Communist Party The Yugoslav Communist Party, which Tito helped set up, found, is dominated by Serbs. Okay, so you have all kinds of other people in the Yugoslav Communist Party, other ethnic group that is dominated by Serbia. Totalitarian rule. This is a big thing. Totalitarian rule, communist rule, it suppresses all of these ethnic tension in Yugoslavia. Remember communism, remember Marxism? Marxism views nationalism as a threat, right? A threat to the creation of the workers' paradise. The food shortages, the mass murder, and so the bad economies of Marxism. And so when Tito takes over and the Yugoslav Communist Party takes over, they suppress they suppress all these ethnic identities and all the ethnic nationalism. Kind of keeps it under wraps, puts a lid on it. Okay, so that's Yugoslavia from 1945 to 1985. Okay. Well, Tito dies in the early 90s. After about 4 decades of rule, Tito dies. And that's why I mentioned a little bit ago, the lid comes off. Okay. The man we need to know is Slobodan Milosevic. Okay. Okay, so Slobodan Milosevic, after Tito leaves, dies, Slobodan Milosevic comes to power in the Yugoslav Communist Party. Okay. Okay. Well, here's a problem. Now that Tito's gone, Tito is the glue that holds all these ethnic groups together. Okay. Well, Tito dies, and that kind of takes the lid off of all these ethnic tensions that have been suppressed for 4 decades. So, as Slobodan Milosevic comes to power, he's coming to power in a communist party that's losing control of the country. Okay. Slobodan Milosevic, though, is also a Serb nationalist. Okay. So even though Slobodan Milosevic is communist, he's a Marxist. He believes in nationalism for his people. He believes that Serbs should dominate Yugoslavia. Serbs should be the most important group in Yugoslavia. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. So Slobodan Milosevic comes to power, and all these other ethnic group leaders, they're suspicious of Milosevic because they think Milosevic wants to go from this communist party that suppresses ethnic tensions. They're worried that Slobodan Milosevic will create a dictatorship, a non-communist dictatorship that has a lot of socialism, but has Serb nationalism as its most prominent feature. Okay, so this is going to cause a lot of tension within the Yugoslav Communist Party by the late 80s. So join me in 1991. We'll go through the list of each of these areas. So Yugoslavia is made up of all these different individual republics or sections of Yugoslavia. Kind of like the United States has all these different states. Yugoslavia has all these different republics. They're not provinces or states. They're their own kind of republics with their own communist parties. And they just answer to the Yugoslav Communist Party, which Tito used to run, and now Slobodan Milosevic runs. So first, Slovenia. Okay. In June of 1991, Slovenia vote, the Slovenian people, they have an election, and they vote to leave Yugoslavia. Slovenia has an extremely small Serb population. Hardly any Serbs live in Slovenia. Slovenia is in the northern part of what's Yugoslavia. Today, if you look at a map of Europe, you can see where Slovenia was. Slovenia was the very northern tip of Yugoslavia. So in June of 1991, they leave rather peacefully. There's a minor attempt. There's a minor attempt by the Serb army, the Yugoslav army, to try to keep Slovenia in. It's called the 10-Day War. There's a small attempt to keep them, but Slovenia leaves in June of 1991. Croatia in the summer of 1991 attempts to leave Yugoslavia at the same time. Here's the problem, though. Croatia has a very large Serb population. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic wants, and a lot of Serbs, they want to live in Serbia. They want to live in a Yugoslavia or Serbia, that is Serb. And so when Croatia tries to leave, Croatia borders Slovenia to the south. So Slovenia is the top, Croatia is to the south and the west, and even the east. Okay? So Croatia is to the south and west and east. Well, when Croatia leaves, the Yugoslav army and local Serbs rise up and they start a civil war in Croatia to keep Croatia from leaving. It's called the Croatian-Serb War. Okay? What ends up happening is part of Croatia is Croatia, and then there's an area of Croatia that is dominated by Serbs demographically, and they kind of detach themselves and they call themselves a separate republic. So for some years, Croatia is divided in two. You have Croatia for the Croats, and then there's a part of Croatia that says, well, we're a Serb republic, and we cooperate with Serbia. Okay. In 1992, a little while after Slovenia and Croatia leave, Bosnia decides it wants to leave Yugoslavia. The problem with Bosnia is Bosnia has a large Croat population and they have a large Serb population. Okay? In Bosnia, there's three major groups: the Croats, the Bosnians, and the Serbs. Okay? So when Bosnia wants to leave, guess what both the Croats and the Serbs do? They both invade, and then local Serbs and Croats rebel. So Bosnia falls into a conflict. This is where the war gets ugly. Because why? The term ethnic cleansing starts. What happens is each group starts ethnically cleansing a region so that at the peace table they'll say, see, only Serbs live here, this should be Serb, or only Croats live here, this should be Croat, only Bosnians live here. Okay? And so you have ethnic cleansing going on as each side, Bosnian, Serb, and Croat, try to create a map where their group dominates the region. Okay? War crimes come out of this this area. And so Slovenia leaves rather peacefully. Croatia, a war starts. And then Bosnia, another war starts. Okay. The European-U.S. reaction. Europe makes weak attempts at diplomacy. They don't want to use force. They kind of weak-kneed about it. They want the U.S. to get involved. Well, when the whole Yugoslav thing comes apart, the Bush administration is still in office. And their stance is it's a European issue. So the Bush administration doesn't really take part in any attempt to end this conflict. The Clinton administration, when they come into office in January 1993, they argue it's also a European issue. They don't want to get involved. Eventually, though, they will. And that's where you get the Dayton Peace Accords. The Clinton administration comes in and sets up a peace treaty where all the sides can agree on. It's also going to be the dismemberment of Yugoslavia. Croatian independence with its borders is respected. So those Serbs living in Croatia, they're done. They have to accept Croatian independence. Okay. In Bosnia, they create this weird map where different groups have their area, their territory. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle all over the place. And they have a rotating presidency. So, like today, even today, whenever Bosnia, whoever is the president, is a rotating president. So, one term, a Bosnian is the president. The next term, a Serb is president. The next term, a Croat is president. So they don't really have elections, so to speak. They kind of do, but it's more for the leadership of each area, and because then it's a rotating president. You know who's going to be the president each term. Okay, so this is one of the accomplishments of the Clinton administration. Is the Dayton Peace Accords. So the Soviet Union. So what is the Soviet Union? So the Soviet Union is a massive multi-ethnic, multinational state with hundreds, if not thousands, of different ethnic groups in it. Okay? That's why you don't just say Russia. It's the Soviet Union. There are hundreds of ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. Okay? Now, even though there's hundreds of ethnic groups, within the Soviet Union, there were 15 republics that represented the major ethnic groups of the Soviet Union. Okay? So, if you were one of like the big 15, you got your own ethnic group. You got your own republic. Okay? The Russian Republic, the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, dominates the Soviet Union. It's the biggest republic. It's culturally the biggest. Politically the biggest. So when you look at a map of the Soviet Union, Russia is massive. The Russian Soviet Socialist Republic is the big boy. The Russians dominate the Soviet Union. Okay? And then you got these 14 other ethnic groups or 14 other republics. You know, they kind of got to do what the Russian Republic says. So join me in 1990 and 1992 as communism is falling in Eastern Europe, 1989. As communism falls apart in Eastern Europe, these different republics are testing how far they can go with their independence, right? Because what's Mikhail Gorbachev doing in Eastern Europe? Nothing, right? Mikhail Gorbachev rejects the Brezhnev Doctrine, right? The Soviet Union is not going to intervene in Eastern European affairs, right? We're not going to interfere in Afghanistan. We're going to leave Afghanistan, okay? So it's a signal. Everyone's going, oh, Mikhail Gorbachev, he's not going to do anything. Here's the problem, though. Eastern Europe, those are other countries, right? When these other 14 Soviet republics start testing how far they can do, Mikhail Gorbachev has a very different reaction. Okay, Mikhail Gorbachev does not want the Soviet Union to fall apart. Okay, I mean he'll lose his country. He wants to maintain the Soviet Union. Okay, and so he's going to try to keep him in by force. Your example is Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are Baltic countries. They border like where Poland is, like Poland, Ukraine. They're kind of up in that area. Finland's kind of up in that area. Well, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, before World War II, they were their own independent countries. When the Soviet Union came in to liberate them from the Germans, Stalin kept them in the Soviet Union. They weren't allowed to be independent. Okay? And so here in 1991, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia say, you know what? We want to leave the Soviet Union. We want to leave the Soviet Union. What does Gorbachev do? He sends in the tanks. All three countries, he sends in Russian tanks to all three countries' capitals to try to put down the protests. Okay? And once again, Gorbachev had, just like Poland, Czechoslovakia had the choice. Do you start shooting? Gorbachev sends in the tanks. Okay? Ultimately, Gorbachev decides not to start shooting, to keep him in by force. Well, there you go. Okay. So what happens is, if you're not willing to use force and they don't want to stay, you got to let them go, right? So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia will declare themselves independent of the Soviet Union. So guess what happens? All these other Soviet republics, they start declaring their independence too. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Moldova. They start declaring their independence too. Okay. So there's two guys we got to talk about, Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, we already know, is premier of the Soviet Union. But what's the problem? By the summer of 1991, there's not really a Soviet Union left, right? All the republics are leaving the Soviet Union. So Mikhail Gorbachev, he's still going, I'm in charge, I'm running the country. Well, Boris Yeltsin is president of the Russian Republic. Okay? And Boris says, I'm in charge. Right? It's the Russian Republic. And so, Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev and Yeltsin are going to get into a power struggle as like who's in charge. Is Mikhail Gorbachev in charge? Because he's premier of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union is falling apart. So Boris Yeltsin says, I'm in charge now. The Soviet Union, it's disappearing. So I'm in charge. Okay? In August of 1991, Soviet hardliners, communist hardliners, they launched a coup to get rid of Boris Yeltsin, and their ultimate goal is to bring back the Soviet Union by force. Okay? So if things go according to plan, these coup makers, these guys that are doing the coup, they're gonna get rid of Yeltsin, okay, and then they're gonna forcibly bring back the Soviet Union. They'll start shooting, okay. Yeltsin's kind of a hero in this situation as he stands up to the coup makers, and the coup falls apart. Why? The coup plotters, they kind of they started having cold feet about shooting people. A lot of Russian military units, they refuse to start shooting. Again, same thing. If you're not willing to keep them in by force and they want to leave, what are you going to do? The coup actually falls apart, and the coup launches Yeltsin to fame. Yeltsin's like, I'm the top dog. Okay? Gorbachev's credibility and popularity sinks. Even though he didn't support the coup, he was on vacation. But it kind of humiliates Gorbachev and really launches Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin can say, I saved Russia. I stopped the coup. Yeltsin and Gorbachev will negotiate. On December 26, 1991, it will be the end of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin was president of the Russian Federation. What the Russian Federation was you have Russia, and then like the Ukraine and some other republics are now their own countries. They're their own countries, but will cooperate on some things. So the Soviet Union is officially gone. We're going to talk about Afghanistan. As you can see, I have a lot of stuff on Afghanistan. Let me get a drink of water real quick. Okay, so Afghanistan. A little bit of history of Afghanistan, on Afghanistan. So, ancient Afghanistan. Afghanistan, the people that lived in Afghanistan a long time ago, anciently, were Buddhists predominantly. You wouldn't know that because when Islam took over, it destroyed. Just like when Islam took over the Middle East, it destroyed Christianity. When they took over Afghanistan, they just suppressed and destroyed the Buddhism. When they took over Iran, Zoroastrianism is destroyed. So a lot of these places in the Middle East, you think it's all Muslim, and it always has been. But what you don't realize is before Islam, the Middle East was Christian. Persia, Iran was Zoroastrianism, and Afghanistan was Buddhist. And so, but you don't know that now because Islam has suppressed all these different religious groups. Anyway, so it becomes Islam as Islamic armies invaded and took over. In the 19th and early 20th century, Afghanistan is not a nation. It's ruled like ostensibly the British, Russians. They have some influence in the region, but it's ultimately local tribal leaders control the region. Okay. By World War II, there are attempts to create a nation-state called Afghanistan, and it will be ruled by a pro-Western civilian government. So you have all these warlords and tribal groups, and after World War II, there's an attempt to kind of bring them all together into this country called Afghanistan. And they'll have a pro-Western civilian government. In the mid-1970s, the Communist Revolution is going to overthrow that pro-Western government. Afghan warlords rise up and they revolt against the communist government. And as we mentioned before, that causes the Soviet Union in December 1979 to invade Afghanistan. The current administration response, as we mentioned before, was pretty weak. Nothing. We'll boycott the Summer Olympics. What did the Reagan administration do? They send in the CIA. The CIA starts indiscriminately handing out the weapons, right? Money and weapons and literally just whoever. If you said you were anti-communist, you got money and weapons, and so they don't keep track of who they give money and weapons to. It's just a free. So it's the Old West, just a free for all. Okay. Osama bin Laden, he's the son of a really wealthy man in Saudi Arabia. He starts a movement called Al Qaeda, which is the base in Arabic. His Al Qaeda group goes to Afghanistan to fight. They may or may not have gotten their hands on American weapons and money. So this leads to a myth that Osama bin Laden was a CIA, connected to the CIA, and that's just not true. The CIA didn't hire Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden didn't work for the CIA. Osama bin Laden considered America the Great Satan. Okay, Osama bin Laden would not have cooperated with the United States. Okay, the CIA handing out money and weapons so indiscriminately. Is it possible that weapons and money ended up in the hands of Al Qaeda? Sure. Okay, because it was pretty indiscriminate. But it is not valid. It is inaccurate to say that Osama bin Laden was hired and worked for the CIA. He didn't. He wouldn't have. Okay, Osama bin Laden considered America the great Satan. He wouldn't have cooperated. He would not have cooperated with the CIA. He would have shot him. Okay, so anyway, so you can read what I wrote there about it. So Al Qaeda is they're a militant group that is at first trying to overthrow this communist Afghani government. Okay. There's another group that we have to talk about. They're called the Taliban. Taliban in Arabic means student. Okay, so Pakistan, which borders Afghanistan, they set up these schools or madrasas to teach Islamic religion. Okay, the students that go to these madrasas call themselves the Taliban. It's a group. They form a group, a militant group. We're the Taliban. Okay, they're students of Islamic theology. Their Islamic theology, they want to live how Muhammad lived in the 7th century AD. So it's a very, from our point of view, it's a very strict form of Islam. Burqas for women, women not in schools, men have beards, go to Mecca 5 times a day of praying. Memorize the Quran. It's a very strict form of Islam. Okay, we want to go back and we want to practice Islam how it was practiced in the 7th century. Just like there's some Christians that go, we want to practice Christianity as Christ taught it in the 1st century AD. Well, these Muslims, these Taliban, they're like, we want to practice Islam how Muhammad did in the 7th century AD. So Pakistan has set up all these madrasas. Okay. Well, they take the Pakistan intelligence services, they give weapons and money to this Taliban group, and they send them into Afghanistan to fight. Okay, the Soviets. So you get it? So you have the Soviets are supporting the Soviet government, right? Sorry, the Soviets are supporting this communist Afghani government, right? Then you have these Afghani warlords that are being supported by the CIA. You have Al Qaeda from Saudi Arabia fighting, and then Pakistan supports the Taliban. Can you see how it's this crazy mix? Everyone's fighting everyone, kind of thing, right? Well, I mentioned this earlier. In 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev pulls the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan and tells its communist government good luck, just like we did with South Vietnam, right? In 1973, we left South Vietnam and we told the non-communist South Vietnamese government good luck. Well, Gorbachev does it in 1989 to this communist government in Afghanistan saying, we're leaving, good luck. Okay? So the Soviets leave. Guess what the CIA does? We leave. Okay? The Soviets leave, the CIA leaves, so what's left? You have the Taliban, these Pakistani trained and supported militants. You have Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and you have all these Afghanistan warlords. They're still fighting. They're still fighting that communist government. So a power vacuum develops. Okay? We leave, the Soviets leave, and we let them just kind of fight each other. Okay? Eventually, that communist government, it falls. Who takes over? Those warlords. All those warlords fighting, they take over. Well, guess what? They're too busy fighting each other. What happens? The Taliban, with Pakistani support, they sweep in, and by 1995, the Taliban take over. So the Taliban are in charge of Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda group during this period, they leave and they go to Sudan for a while. They will eventually come back to Afghanistan. Okay. So by the eve of 9/11, September 11th, the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban are in control in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden has come back from Sudan to Afghanistan and is living there on the eve of 9/11. Lastly, I want to tell you kind of a funny story about the CIA. So remember what I told you a minute ago. The CIA, they indiscriminately have given all this money and weapons out, right? Well, after the CIA leaves, after a year or two, there's still fighting going on in Afghanistan. The Taliban, Al Qaeda, these warlords. The CIA goes, oh no, there's all these American weapons, Stinger missiles, weapons in Afghanistan, and money, right? And so the CIA is worried that American weapons are going to be used in wars. So what does the CIA do? After 1989, after about a year or two, by 1991, the CIA goes back into Afghanistan, and their goal is they're trying to recover all these weapons. So the CIA goes back into Afghanistan with all these suitcases full of cash, looking to buy back all the weapons that they indiscriminately handed out during the Afghan War from 1979 to 1981 to 1989. Okay, so it's kind of a funny story. The CIA has to go back, and they're like, okay, where are the weapons? And they hand out the cash too. So it's like, do you have American weapons? Here's a ton of money. Give us back the weapons. So it's kind of a funny story there. Kind of going back in. That is the end of the Cold War. That also gets you into the 90s with Yugoslavia and Afghanistan. Have a good day.